Hello, this is Stephen Coates of the Bureau of Lost Culture. What is the Bureau of Lost Culture? Well, we're a collective dedicated to recollecting, unearthing, reanimating, revivifying lost, half-remembered, half-forgotten countercultural stories. And today we are hearing the story of the UFO. Not unidentified flying object, not yet, that's going to come later. But the UFO, the underground freak out, the club that existed for a very brief time in 1967 and 1968 here in London, but seemed to be one of the most influential institutions of the London countercultural underground. And I'm here with Peter Watts, the journalist, but also a music countercultural historian. Hello, Pete.
Hello.
Are you a Londoner?
I am a Londoner. Yeah, in fact, I have only ever lived within the M25.
I love it. It's funny, actually, I was reading about you, and you are a journalist, writer, amazing blog, a great one, a countercultural historian. You started off as a journalist when you were 17, right?
I did, yeah. I started off writing about sport, actually, at the Sunday Times. I mean, and I did get a lucky break. I don't think it was even particularly common then. But I guess what there was I could start working doing football results, keying them in at a national newspaper and get paid for it at a very young age. And that allowed me to get into the newspaper business through that route. I don't know whether those sort of jobs still exist because a lot of it will be automated or just, it doesn't require as much manpower as it did. So
yeah, but I think also times have changed. It's almost like the bar. The bar is different now, isn't it? It's like, even though everything's about being inclusive and stuff, in some ways it's...
journalism is like famously a really unequal industry as well. And, it's a massive amount of Oxbridge candidates get in there. It's much harder to do it without a degree of any kind and without any... background in sort of journalism at all.
Yeah. So, but you have evolved from there. You've written for lots and lots and lots of newspapers and books. And, in terms of what we're going to talk about today, you've written about this amazing club, the UFO. And how do you describe it, the UFO? It's difficult to sort of sum up because it's, as a place, just round the corner from here, up in Tottenham Court Road, right? But existed for such a brief time and yet has become this kind of mythic place. And as I said, rightly so in many ways, because so many things seem to either happen there or personalities seem to be revolving around it.
Yeah.
And then many of whom became very famous and influential for counterculture and even in just the culture right afterwards.
Yeah, what's fascinating about it is that it was like all of the things that went into form the counterculture of 1967 could be found there for this very brief time. And then when it closed, it was almost like the counterculture then kind of didn't evaporate, but it fragmented into lots of different organisations, and and for a while, it was all contained. And you had politics, you had music, you had art, you had avant-garde film, you had shops like Granny Takes a Trip, who you had food there. You had, politics was very political. Like Release was formed there, that sort of drug charity. It all went on under this roof of this Irish club in Tottenham Court Road, in a way that I don't think happened before or since, where it was all so beautifully put in one place. Yeah. And as you say, with all those very important figures from who are sort of counterculture legends like Barry Miles and Hoppy Hopkins, but also big people like McCartney and Hendrix and Townsend, and they were all involved in it as well.
I think the other thing which is fascinating from a point of view of a sort of temporal point of view, it's over 50 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. But like the Summer of Love, so-called Summer of Love in London, like the Summer of Love in America, was this incredibly short period, wasn't it? Yeah. Like punk was later. When Barry Kane was in it, we're talking about, it's just a couple of years, really, a very small scene. Yeah. Possibly even you could say the same about rave stuff later in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. This very brief window when this thing happens for lots of cultural reasons. And it's had these gigantic ramifications, hasn't it?
Certainly very brief in its purest form, I think. Obviously it continues in various ways, but becomes commercialised. One of the great things about UFO, which I think is the sort of the way the heads would have described it, UFO, is that it was formed by the counterculture. It wasn't a sort of commercial enterprise coming in and trying to sort of tap in and appropriate the hippie or freak lifestyle. It was formed by Hoppy and Joe Boyd, who were very much from that world.
Yeah.
So it was kind of unsullied quite early on, by other interests.
So, so I'm going to call it UFO from now on. Obviously, rather than the UFO. But let's back up the truck. So it's 1966, and going into 67. It's a building, or it's a basement up off Tottenham Court Road. So just tell us how UFO came about, and so where it was, and
its origins were in the sort of Notting Hill scene of like the London Free School and the early days of Notting Hill Carnival, and they put on Hoppy Hopkins, who was he was a sort of physicist really and photographer, who then became a very key member of the underground. He formed International Times, the underground newspaper, IT. With Barry Miles. He put on a few nights at a church hall in Notting Hill where Pink Floyd played. This proved to be quite successful. They decided to sort of take that into the centre of London, partly really as a way of raising money to pay for IT, because IT was, it was a really important, it was the only way of the counterculture and the alternative society kind of, communicating with each other, So they wanted to keep that going. It was always getting busted by the police. They were struggling to get anyone to even print a lot of their issues. So they needed money. They came up with the idea of having this club to do that. They looked for venues, and I think Joe Boyd, the sort of music producer, who came at it very much from a slightly different angle to Hoppy. Hoppy was quite political and quite pure, as we said. Boyd was he was political, but he was also very interested in music and finding interesting and exciting music to produce and promote. He found this club, an old Irish ballroom on the Tottenham Court Road, right at the bottom of the Tottenham Court Road. It's no longer there. I think it's pretty much now where, I think there's a branch of Waterstones there. It's pretty much there. It was underneath the cinema. The Irish landlord said, you can have it for 15 quid on a Friday night. And they moved in, and they did their first 2 nights either side of Christmas in December 66. And the house band was Pink Floyd. And as I said, the idea was this was going to be almost like IT in a kind of 3-dimensional immersive form. So you would go there, and there'd be like, they'd play a Kurosawa films or W.C. Fields shorts, and there'd be light shows, and there'd be music, and there'd be food. It was all those things that made up the sort of nascent underground.
So nothing like that at the time either. I mean, that kind of combination of sort of politics, music, art, avant-garde, food, fashion, it was all kind of all mixed up together.
This was pre-festivals. There was, there'd been, the Marquee had tried, there'd been little attempts at doing things like this, like one-off things, but certainly nothing in such a prime location on such a regular basis. They brought in some of their friends to design the posters, and that kind of created really the sort of British psychedelic art movement, which is a really interesting thing of its own.
So that came out of actually doing the publicity posters for UFO.
Yeah. So Boyd and Hopkins both put together, they had friend Nigel Weymouth and Michael English, and they were both kind of interested in art, and they put them together, and they kind of collectively formed this art collective who designed the very first UFO posters. And that was pretty much the beginning of the psychedelic art form. People like Martin Sharp and were doing things in Australia and had come over to England to do things. But that was really the English genesis of it.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that one, but let's talk about the music, because this was the same thing, wasn't it? That at that time, these bands that went on to be absolutely massive, like Pink Floyd, they were kind of all sort of knew each other, didn't they? That was the point, I suppose, wasn't it? They were sort of like buddies, or kind of, been to school together or college together, quite a few of them, or there was a kind of network of people, wasn't it?
Well, I think that's the thing to remember, really, is how small this world was. I think they all knew each other. It was quite a small world of, really dedicated hippies and freaks. And they, and they all knew IT. They knew each other through IT. They knew each other through the Notting Hill scene. And what was interesting is, included in that are superstars, not just people like Pink Floyd who had become superstars, but actual already existing superstars like Townsend and Eric Burdon and Paul McCartney. They all were considered themselves part of this world. And I think I read a story, Alan Aldridge, who is another psychedelic artist. He once, he wanted to interview Paul McCartney. He decided this was going to be his big break. And he just found his number in the phone book and phoned him up and said, I want to come around and interview you. And Paul McCartney said, yeah, sure, come round. I'm not doing anything right now. It was quite accessible.
Yeah.
And so, they did all know each other. And they were all on the same side. And whenever I've interviewed people from this scene, they all talk about the importance of drugs, not so much as in, because it, mind-altering experiences, but because it kind of, it was a bonding thing, because they all either smoked or took acid. And if you did that, you were a criminal and you were a target.
Right.
I mean, that didn't matter whether you were George Harrison or, if you were anybody, any hippie, anyone with long hair was targeted by the police because of their drug use. And that brought them all together.
Right, and in your piece on it, I read, I think it might maybe a quote from Twink, but he says that helped the scene, and so there was a real conflation of poor bohemians, wealthy posh people, and the new rich rock and rollers. Each category helped the other, often funding things like IT and UFO. So it's a very unusual from that point of view, isn't it? So you've got rock royalty, Paul McCartney and the Who and all that stuff, already didn't need that scene in a way, you could sort of say. And then you've got people who are sort of right at the bottom of the tree, and then and sort of bohemians and even kind of like, sort of those homeless people kind of wandering into the offices of IT, weren't they? It was you can't imagine that now, I think. The world has changed, hasn't it? So
yeah, I think so. I mean, one thing I was thinking about UFO and why it's interesting is that it also was kind of the beginning of that idea of the counterculture being a kind of a collection of interests and political outlook. I think that has kind of dispersed now, and I think maybe that kind of had gone sometime. Maybe Britpop was the end of that moment. Even when in the 80s and 90s, if you were into underground music, you were also into underground films, and then a whole lifestyle came with that and a certain outlook. Certainly the case in punk, certainly the case in dance culture. I think that no longer really exists in that form. And I think it began with UFO.
I mean, I suppose you could say that for the Beatles or for McCartney and for Lennon, that they were in this whole period of reinventing themselves and wanted to do that. So, buying into this nascent thing that was going on was part of that transformation for them too, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think Paul McCartney, obviously, I think the other thing is they're all different. All these people have their own reasons and interests, and Pete Townsend has a very different view on it to Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney's view, I think, would be more like found these ideas really interesting. He found people like Barry Miles. He'd never. This was new stuff. Barry Miles was very well educated. Paul McCartney, he wasn't. He came from a different background. He was interested in music. So Miles introduced him to a whole world of avant-garde art and film that he'd never have known otherwise. And, it was an eye-opening experience for him. Someone like Pete Townsend, who's much more sort of conflicted about it, and his attitude was that the freaks were kind of using the superstars to kind of raise their own profile. And he was a bit wary. He was a bit kind of... He talks about how they all thought they were cleverer than us, but they needed us.
Right.
But that's very much Pete Townsend's point of view. It's
there might be
illustrative of his outlook generally.
Both things might be true, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, from the Beatles' point of view, it's interesting because they had gone from, I think, Love Me Do to kind of Revolution number 9. It's about, 4 or 5 years or something, isn't it? An incredibly short period of time. And then they probably wouldn't have been able to do that without those influences coming in from all over the place, right?
Absolutely
avant-garde
not.
stuff, cut-ups, music concrete. Where was that coming from? These were sort of four Scouse lads, playing the clubs of Hamburg, weren't they?
Yeah.
And then this huge, mop-top stardom. And tuning into this made a huge difference. I suppose it's tempting, and maybe we could talk about it, to wonder if the common thread, the kind of common fluid in this thing is LSD, because it's that time, isn't it? I mean, it's LSD's been around for a while, and quite a long time actually, but it's sort of come in from America and stuff, and it's people are turning on and they're tuning in and dropping out, and that sort of brought all sorts of people together, didn't it? Because they're all having these extraordinary psychedelic experiences, right?
Yeah,
something's woken up, right?
Oh yeah, I think you definitely can't ignore the importance of LSD. Not even I don't think even as a drug as much as a sort of a glue almost, like you know, like you don't even have to take it, I guess is what I'm trying to say, for it to affect your consciousness. That's what's fascinating about LSD at this time. You know, there were bands and artists who were embracing the LSD, you know, the concepts of LSD, of its visual and oral changes, without actually having taken the drug, because it was just in the culture.
Right, and you said that in your piece, because I think there were some musicians who were like, we weren't actually taking acid, but we were being influenced by acid-inspired music.
Absolutely,
They were changing what they did in response to the music that other people were making under the effects or because of acid, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that was probably something you've only ever seen, maybe ecstasy culture sort of towards the end of the 80s and 90s, where this very similar thing was going on. LSD was hugely important, and part of the UFO experience was kind of creating the right environment for a good trip as well. I think, you know, we got the sounds and you got the visuals and you got a loving environment. You know, they used to talk about, like, you know, if there were sort of hostile people were present, they'd love bombing them. You know, they'd go around. You know, it was a very that was part of the experience. It was creating the right setting, and obviously setting was what they talked about a lot with LSD at that time.
And setting, right?
Yeah,
and also you've got great food for when your clients come down a bit.
Yeah, of course, yeah,
which is important. So actually, let's go back to UFO then. So because it only existed for about a year, so maybe Pete, you could trace that year from Joe Boyd and Hoppy, and you know they started up. Joe Boyd obviously became very well known a bit more later, didn't he? Witch Season and Nick Drake and Cat Stevens and all that stuff, didn't he? But so he's programming the music. Hoppy is sort of directing it in some ways.
Yeah, I think so. He's a kind of general kind of ringmaster. He's an interesting guy, Hoppy. I mean, he died a couple of years ago. I think he's because he never kind of wrote books quite in the same way that someone like Barry Miles did. He's sort of not given maybe quite as much prominence as he should be, because he was really, you know, an integral part of the scene. And he was he brought together a lot of interesting people. I mean, so what you had at UFO was, Boyd was doing the music, he'd bring in Pink Floyd, and then when Pink Floyd got too big, he replaced them with Soft Machine. There were other bands who'd play there regularly, like Tomorrow would play a lot. I think Boyd also brought in Procul Harem, who played. I think they played when White Shade of Pale was at number one. They played UFO at that point because they'd been booked a few weeks before it came out. He brought The Move in because he quite liked The Move, and The Move were one of those bands who weren't really psychedelic hippies, but they definitely knew how to make that sound. And I think that was a slightly unsuccessful evening. I was just sort of rereading Jonathan Green's book about the era, Days in the Life. And he says it wasn't quite as successful as he'd hoped it would be, because they were seen as slightly, you know, cultural. They weren't from the scene, whereas a band like Tomorrow very much were from the scene.
Let's have a listen to Tomorrow then, right? It's all in there, isn't it, Pete? I mean, the lyrics, the time changes, the sort of the backward tape bits and stuff, and I mean, I was going to say it's a bit Beatlesy, but maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we're Beatles influenced by Tomorrow. Or...
It's so funny hearing it and listening to it in the context of what we've just been talking about, and it suddenly all jumped out. The other thing I was thinking about was. They talked about how all the hippies at the time would wear bells, you know. So and when it was sort of the end of UFO Club, they'd all come out at dawn, and like people nearby would hear all the bells ringing, so it sounded like goat herds. And in the middle of that, there's obviously the bicycle bell ringing, which made me think about that, and whether that was a deliberate kind of nod to the kind of bell wearing hippies or not.
Well, also, didn't it refer to a sort of an early Boris Bike scheme in Amsterdam where you could sort of, which is still going, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing. The Dutch anarchist group, the Provo's, who are one of the most fascinating, probably my favourite anarchist collective of the 60s. They were the Provo's, and they got 50 bicycles, painted them white, and just distributed them free in Amsterdam. And that was the idea. And I talked to Sam Hutt, the Hank Wangford, who was on the scene at the time, and he had a white bicycle in London. You know, he had a bicycle, he painted it white in a sort of, you know, a nod to Tomorrow and the Dutch anarchists, because they were all, you know, it was seen as a global movement. It really was. I mean,
I love that. I mean, of course, it's still going in Amsterdam, and of course, I mean, we've got our own commercialised version of it with Boris Bikes now, which is, you know, it's a great thing, isn't it? And we had Sam Hutt in, Hank Wangford, and of course I can imagine him with the most unconventional doctor in London, sort of long hair and his Zappa moustache and his white bike cycling around, terrifying
Love
grannies.
To see some pictures of that.
He, I mean, we could talk more about that stuff in it, but Tomorrow then, I mean, I don't know much about that stuff, but they're not one of the more well-known bands from that era, are they?
No, they're not, and they were really a sort of, you know, I think My White Bicycle was a really big song at UFO. The other song they did was Revolution, which was, you know, again seen as quite a big song, because, you know, also a lot of the people did genuinely believe there was a revolution of some kind or other going on. Some of them thought it might be a Marxist revolution, some of them thought it was a cultural revolution.
Or a revolution of consciousness, at least, right?
Yeah, and Tomorrow were definitely... But even within that band, I think you had different outlooks. So you had Steve Howe, who went on to play in Yes, who I don't know how much he was involved in it. But Twink, the drummer, was very much a believer. He later played with the Pink Fairies, who were another kind of, you know, they kind of carried the flag on up until punk.
Didn't he convert to Islam as well?
Yeah, he did, yeah. He's still around.
Is he still practicing Islam?
He is, yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I can't remember his new name, unfortunately,
like
but
Cat Stevens,
Yeah.
So they were playing at UFO, and I think I read in your article as well that around about this time, Hoppy gets busted.
So that was acid. A big thing. So it was going well, the club, but you know, it was attracting the interests of the law because, you know, as we talked about, the importance of drugs for the underground and also for the, you know, the authorities as a way of sort of clamping down on the underground. I think one of the early nights they had a sort of spot the fuzz competition, which was like look out for undercover officers at UFO. Hoppy got busted, and
what were the circumstances of that? How did that come about?
Do you know what? I off the top of my head, I'm not entirely sure. I think he got someone just said, you know, this guy's almost certainly carrying. They broke into his flat with a warrant and arrested him, and he got 8 months, I think, in prison. And there was a sort of there were two effects on that. One of them was they did a huge fundraiser at Alexandra Palace, which was the Technicolor Dream, which was basically UFO kind of transposed to the Alexandra Palace. And the other thing was that Joe Boyd kind of came in and took over more control, and there became more of a kind of conflict, I guess, between the commercial and the cultural or the countercultural reasons behind UFO. I mean, there's so many interesting currents going on. People like Mick Farron, who was like doing the Door. But
who was Mick Farron?
So Mick Farron was he was a kind of he was a hippie and an anarchist. He was in a band called the Social Deviants, but he was a bit heavier. Like, you know, he was quite into. He wasn't coming from the intellectual side of the counterculture, I guess, is what you'd say. So he was often used as a bit of a sort of. He's a very smart man. He also died fairly recently, but he was used as a sort of like the doorman. He would go in and, like, if there was a problem, they'd call for Mick to sort it out. But he also did things like, took over IT's office at one point because he didn't think that they were doing things the right way. He was...
So quite tough.
Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose they would need hippies need a doorman like everybody else, don't they?
Yeah.
Keep out the wrong sort and all that stuff.
I mean, later on they used the sort of the British Black Panthers, Michael X's British Black Panthers, to do the door, because I think when they moved, the UFO eventually had to move to Camden, and there they attracted the attention of the skinheads, and that got quite nasty.
So Hoppy's in prison.
Yeah.
So Joy Boyd's, who's a music producer and stuff, it's becoming, maybe the club's becoming more music focused, is it, as well? And at the same time, I mean, it's drawing a bigger crowd. I mean, people like Jenny Fabian, who we had in, the author of Groupie. I think the book opens with a night there when she meets somebody who's obviously Syd Barrett in his decline, and so it starts to draw people, punters and celebs, I suppose, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think also it's drawing what would the weekenders, the weekend hippies, who the real freaks, the 24/7 freaks had a bit of disdain for. People always do, for outsiders coming into their culture, and I think that was a problem. So they did, but the big event at Alexandra Palace was the kind of, that might have been in some ways, even though it wasn't actually on Tottenham Court Road, the kind of key moment for that. They had a helter-skelter, John Lennon turned up.
14-hour Technicolor Dream, so it was an all-nighter, right?
Yeah, I mean, UFO was an all-nighter as well.
Okay.
That's the other thing to remember about UFO. One of the things that IT was agitating for was a 24-hour London, and they felt if they were going to put a club on, it had to be one that kind of embraced that philosophy. So I think it opened at 10 and closed at 8 a.m., in time to get the tube home. So people do say that around 5 or 6 it could get pretty depressing. Everyone's just asleep. But they maintained that it was an all-nighter, and the Technicolor Dream was also an all-nighter.
Right. And so how did that go? So that was like fundraiser, profile raiser for Hoppy and the Stones had been busted, or they were about to be busted as well.
Stones were being, God, it's tough difficult without the timeline in front of me to remember it all. I don't think the Stones had quite been busted at that point, and they got busted later.
But it was in the air, so it's about the establishment's fighting back. There's this burgeoning hippie countercultural underground scene, not just in London, but obviously centred in London, and word has got out, and the establishment don't like it. They're starting to crack down. Hoppy's in prison, probably a few other people get arrested, and then they have this Technicolor Dream thing in Alexandra Palace, which is amazing that they managed to get that place to do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about this. People have this idea that, like, the hippies were a bit sort of like dreamy and like, sort of insubstantial, I think. And what always impresses me is they had some really big ambitions, and they pulled them off. So you got there's two things that make me think about that, and one of them is the Technicolor Dream, which was this major event in Alexandra Palace, which they managed to persuade and hire and fit, and I think they raised money. I don't know if they raised money. They hardly ever ended up raising quite as much money as they wanted to, but they certainly raised profile. It was on the news. And the other thing they did around the same time was take out a full-page ad in the Times advocating for a change in the laws around cannabis, which was signed by all 4 Beatles, as well as numerous doctors and politicians. These were really ambitious concepts that they organised and executed.
Do you think there was a feeling that revolution, you mentioned it earlier, that was actually round the corner then, that actually the combination of the raised consciousness of acids, the political influences that people were bringing in from abroad, and you mentioned from Holland, but also from America and stuff, and then this new way of thinking, it's all coming together. Did you think people really felt that actually it's just around the corner?
I'm sure they did. I think if you were in the middle of it, then you definitely believed it was happening. What it was probably very easy to forget if you were in the middle of it was that you were in a very, very, very small bubble. John Peel always talks about how, like, him and his mates would all like talk about how much they love the New Country Joe record, and then you look at it in the charts and it was like 163, and that was when you realised that you were actually a minority. So I think those guys in the middle of it thought it, but that's because they were in the middle of it.
I mean, let's talk about that, because that's interesting in itself. You've got like an underground community now. talking to Jenny Fabian, and obviously what permeates her book Groupie is a kind of like status war, isn't it? As well, it's like who's in, who's out. As Gansberg sang, and within, who's the kind of, obviously her scale was group members, management, and all that stuff. Because as a groupie, but there was this whole thing about it's our scene, and she talks about that. There was this feeling it was our scene, which starts to get taken over, as you say, weekend hippies or commercial interests start to come in. But there was that very much this sense of this is our thing. But what was it? I mean, it was a sort of nebulous sort of thing as well, wasn't it? What defined it as being the underground?
Well, that's a good question. What defines it as being the underground? I mean, on a very basic level, it's your hair, it's your hair and your clothes,
and your drug use, I presume.
Presumably drug use, but as I say, I don't think that was. I think you didn't have to be taking drugs, but you certainly had to not. You certainly had to be sympathetic to the idea of taking drugs, and you had to tolerate being around people who were taking a lot of drugs. And yeah, it was an outlook. It was, and one person I'd like to talk about is Caroline Coon, who formed Release, and that came directly out of UFO. She talks about how part of it was having a kind of, not just an anti-establishment attitude, but like a pro-environment, a pro-race relations, a pro, feminism, anti-gay, not being homophobic, all those kind of things. And now, theoretically, well, they're actually enshrined in law. At that time, it was certainly not the case. And that was one of the major things that came out of this. It was having that attitude that everything was okay.
How did that come out of UFO though?
Release. Release directly was, so Caroline Coon, she had a boyfriend who was busted, West Indian boyfriend, I think, who was busted for drugs. She kind of, in the course of trying to find out, to try to defend him, she did a lot of research into drug laws. She then kind of started acting almost as a consultant for more sort of high offending drug users. Including
the Stones, right?
Including the Stones, yeah, and George Harrison. And part of that was a formation of a group called Release, and that was funded by money from the door at UFO. Right. It was directly funded, a certain percentage of the money. But, within that, I think Hoppy and Caroline Coon didn't actually get on, so this was one of Joe Boyd's thing. So, there's always these complicated factors going on. But, Release still continues to exist today, and is, a really important institution that's come out directly from that movement.
Yeah, so that's what we were saying at the beginning, isn't it? Is that this one place in London for a year, and it's had this kind of like ripple effect, hasn't it? With in terms of countercultural effect of all the stuff going on in music and all sorts of stuff, right? Yeah,
completely. I mean, and you've got people like Hendrix who would come down there and join in, and absorb the vibe and then bring it further to the world. I mean, that's the other really important thing about music and all this, and the fact that the people like the Beatles and the Who were interested is that they went down to the UFO for whatever reason, absorbed the vibe, and then really did give that to the world, including taking it to America, which is what Hendrix really did at sort of Monterey.
Again, borrowed from your piece, but Twink says there's this. Hendrix comes to UFO tomorrow playing, and he jams with him, playing bass, interestingly. And Twink says, he jams playing bass for 20 minutes. And Twink says, a truly magical 20 minutes and a wonderful memory. At the end, I turned to Jimmy, who was now sitting on the floor in front of the bass amp. Jimmy looked up at me and said, is this love? You can't imagine saying that these days.
No, you really can't. I mean, you really can't.
Or not sort of saying it with a straight face. Anyway,
no.
It's sort of. But of course, then it was love, wasn't it?
Yeah, completely.
All you need is love, and that was it, wasn't it?
Well, exactly. Love was the kind of the kind of catchphase, wasn't it? And it then was Lennon wrote "All You Need Is Love," and it kind of became an anthem. But the problem with that is that it can slightly overshadow some of the other elements of it, which was a quite hardcore politics of what was going on, and the kind of the brutal war against the establishment that was, seeing innocent people incarcerated for having a bit of weed in their pocket.
Yeah.
Talking right now at a time when the Tory leadership contest is going on, and they're all admitting having a smoke and cannabis
and denying they enjoyed it,
and enjoyed it, and
I know they're denying they enjoyed it, don't they?
Oh, of course they are. Yeah. Or they took it by accident and never did it again.
Yeah.
But
or denying their younger selves. That's the way it seems to me. It's
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah. I mean, it's a very weird thing.
Yeah, that's another massive subject because of course psychedelic drugs are on the way back in, aren't they? Through sort of university testing and all that sort of stuff. But back at UFO. The year is rolling on, and there's more bands playing. And I'm going to play this track now, and then we can talk about it, or at least its title afterwards, because there's another big part of that whole scene which is important.
Well, she lives all alone in a house by a pool. She wears fur coats and hats. And she's well equipped for the movie auditions in Hollywood town. She always turns up, but she's always turned down.
Granny Takes a Trip. There's the purple gang pit. I'd never heard of that track before, actually. But the title's obviously significant. But it's got a bit of it's got a bit of everything in there, isn't it? A bit of washboard, a bit of skiffle.
It does. It's interesting. It's kind of that other side of the sort of psychedelic movement, which was a slightly sort of almost twee kind of music hall style thing, which kind of Floyd managed to kind of sort of assimilate the two together, and the Beatles as well. I mean, Granny Takes Trips, obviously the name of the shop on the King's Road, which was the elite shopping location for your freaks in your heads.
Which came first, the track or the shop? Then well, that's definitely one for Google, isn't it? Because the massive thing, it's really apparent in Jenny Fabian's book Groupie, is the fashion aspects of it as well, as of course it was in punk and rave as well in a different sort of way. But I mean, this peacocking, the sort of almost like Baroque fashion style's amazing, and in Groupie, she's always Katie, the protagonist, she's always talking about she's got a new hairdo that day, and she's sort of, she's got crushed velvet, super tight trousers and high rough collars and stuff. And it was quite a flamboyant sight, wasn't it? I guess down UFO.
Oh, I imagine it must have been. I mean, one of the real sort of shames is there's almost no existing footage of it. There's a couple of bits of film clips here and there, and there's very few pictures, so you can't quite get an idea of what it really did look like. But yeah, obviously, colourful fashion was such an important part of it, and the men were allowed to wear feminine clothes in a lot of ways.
Well, capes. I mean, men haven't been wearing capes since the Tudor era, Tudor period, had they? And sort of tights and pointy shoes and it was wonderful, wasn't it?
Yeah, and a lot of these things were kind of one-off items, so you had to get it. It wasn't mass. There was no sort of mass market for this. It really was. You had the unique thing, and there was a lot of one-upmanship. Who had this? Who had that? There was a bit of kind of DIY going on as well.
And Granny Takes a Trip, the shop. I mean, I suppose there is a reference because a lot of those clothes that they were adapting, and in the way that later Vivienne Westwood would on King's Road. They were Granny's clothes, weren't they? Stuff from the sort of 20s and 30s, and sort of being.
And similarly, you got the other one was Lord Kitchener's Valet, which was a sort of more military style things, which then sort of you saw on the cover of Sergeant Pepper. That was another aspect of it. Hendrix as well with his kind of military jackets. They were two interesting. I've not really explored the fashion element of it that much. But it's interesting that those were the two of the areas that were being sort of adapted for this psychedelic lifestyle.
Yeah, the military thing, it's interesting because that felt to me, or seems to me, that it was also a bit of a response to military stuff, wasn't it? I mean, later the combat jacket in the early 70s became a sort of
it
de
was
rigueur fashion for a counterculture, type, didn't it? And it was like subverting that, wasn't it?
exactly subverting that. And there's that line, isn't there? In is it the first Beatles film where someone says to Ringo, I fought the war for you, and he says, I bet you regret that, or I bet you wish you'd lost. And that's right. In the very early in the 60s, this generation that had grown up, born maybe at the end of the war and grown up, and were already pissed off with people sort of, thrusting this back down their throats.
And that must have hurt for the people who did fight, actually, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it would have been. We forget, I think, from this distance how little time there was between the end of the Second World War and it's 20 odd years. I mean, that's nothing. You realise when you're in your 40s, but when you're in your 20s, that's your lifetime.
Yeah. So for Ringo and co, it was like, oh, shut up, Dad.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Whereas for the people who'd fought and sort of suffered and all that, it was like, you don't know how good you've got it. We died for you, sort of thing. So it's all coming together, isn't it?
Yeah, and this clearly was a generational clash. I mean, I don't think there were very many older hippies. Even some of the kind of the guys that come from the beat movement were a bit sceptical of the hippie movement. I don't think they saw it as serious because it wasn't about poetry and jazz. And so there was a real generation clash. And I'm sure there were the odd one or two who kind of embraced it, but generally speaking.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing about sort of Granny Takes a Trip and the fashion thing was that, I mean, I guess they were purveyors of groovy scene outfits to the fairly well-to-do, I guess, because I mean, that stuff looked like could be quite expensive, right?
Yeah. I think it was, and I think that's where places like Carnaby Street came in, where you could kind of get it for a bit cheaper. I mean, the rock stars did go there, but I think the other thing to remember is that other than maybe the Beatles, I don't know how much disposable income most bands had at this point. I know that, for instance, like, the Small Faces were, they didn't have a lot of disposable income because they were being screwed left, right and centre. I think the Kinks were similar. A lot of them were not getting as much money as they were entitled to. So they weren't on hugely elevated wages. I think that came later in the 70s when bands began to have a much stronger sense of how much money they were actually worth.
Well, it's also, I think at that time, Miles has said, I love this, his story about coming to London was, I think he, hopped on a coach in Cheltenham or Cirencester, wherever he came from. And this is a potted version of it, but he arrived in London and walked down Charing Cross Road, famous bookshop road in London, and he knew he wanted to work in a bookshop and went into one and said to the guy behind the counter, do you know where I can get a job? And the guy said, you can start now if you like. And then he went out at lunchtime and got himself a flat on Dean Street. And he said that at that time, people didn't get paid very much, but things didn't cost very much.
Yeah.
It was a different kind of economy, I suppose. So,
Yeah. And no one really, living in town was not seen as something particularly aspirational. So, you could get a place in Soho. I think they were available. It was available. It might not be easy, but they were certainly available in a way that now I'd think for most people they're really not, unless you get extremely fortunate.
He did say that there was no electricity in his first place.
Yeah.
When you could wander in and out of a job, and you could, if you live on Dean Street and work on Charing Cross Road, you could walk up to UFO.
Yeah.
Couldn't easily, and then stay there till 3 o'clock in the morning, and then walk home and get a bacon sandwich or something on
completely.
the way. Right?
I mean, I think, for most of these people, the concept of Zone 2 just didn't exist. They did not go outside central London. It was not seen as in any way acceptable, unless you went to somewhere like Notting Hill specifically.
Or Chelsea or something.
Or Chelsea,
yeah. So, Pete, what happened to UFO then? I mean, what was the demise of it?
So the demise of UFO, I mean, I guess Hoppy going inside was probably the kind of part of the long-term demise. It kind of lost a little bit of its kind of warmth, I think, of a little bit of that. It became a little bit more of a music venue because Joe Boyd did have exceptionally good music taste, but that was his interest. It was music, so it became more of a music venue at that point. I mean, there were kind of other moments. There was after the Rolling Stones. I think actually before the Rolling Stones bust, when it was clear that the Stones had been set up by a sting involving the News of the World. The UFO punters all kind of rushed out onto the street and marched on Fleet Street screaming revolution. You know, there were these kind of moments that continued through it. But eventually the kind of press attention got too much. There was a sting in, I think it was might have been the Sunday Mirror, saying that hippies had been, injecting reefer at this underground club in the centre of London. And the Irish landlord, who'd been pretty accommodating, I think, to some of the more extreme avant-garde happenings there, just said, look, I'm going to get busted. I can't keep giving the police a crate of whiskey and asking them to leave me alone. It's not in my interest anymore. So they had to find another venue. And this is where Boyd's kind of ambitions took over slightly, because he went, and rather than finding a similar sized venue in central London, of which, there probably were, there are so many basements in the West End he could have chosen, but he went to the Roundhouse, which was at that time run by Arnold Wesker, the playwright.
Let's have a listen to this. A wonderful venue up in Camden Market as it is now.
Absolutely, and you can see
building.
You can see his ambition in wanting to go for the Roundhouse. I mean, it had been the scene of one of the early kind of parties. There'd been a sort of there's sort of been a big party there at the beginning of I think the IT launch party was held there. So it was a known counterculture venue already, but it was big. You had to have bigger bands. The bands also were starting to ask for more money. You needed more security. It all got bigger, and I think it became much harder to keep, back to that word, pure. And also, I think it got pretty nasty there. I think there were a lot of invasions by skinheads, who were starting to come on the scene. I mean, skinheads. It's interesting. I always think of skinheads as sort of being a sort of later in the 60s movement, maybe 69 is always sort of talked about as the skinhead time. But in 67, they were already on the scene, almost as a, and in everything about them, they were the antithesis of the hippie. They wore, they wore plain clothes, and they had very, very short hair.
It's interesting, the skinhead thing, isn't it? And sort of became associated with like football hooliganism and stuff, didn't it? And because of course they were also counterculture themselves in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. It was working class counterculture in a very different way.
Defining themselves in a way in opposition to that, wasn't it? I mean, obviously skinheads, so you got no hair rather than long hair. Mm-hmm. The clothes themselves were kind of pared down, weren't they? Much more uniform, a bit more military in a strange way, weren't they? And but very stylized actually.
Yeah. And instead of peace and love, you had hate and violence, I think, to a certain extent. The other interesting thing is the music. Skinhead music was the antithesis, really, of hippie music. In that, they loved soul and ska and reggae, and the hippies were liking, we could safely describe as very white music.
Yeah, interesting because of course the mods had sort of split in a way, hadn't they? Some mods became psychedelic, and Small Faces and all that stuff, and other ones went then more down the sort of skinhead route in a way.
Yeah, I think that's generally seen as what happened, or certainly maybe not the original mods, but the kind of the subculture of mods, maybe mods' younger brothers and sisters, split into these two different avenues: the skinheads and the hippies.
You're talking about, Joe Boyd taking youth up to Roundhouse and, getting bigger, getting more commercial, but the launch pad for, bands much more so. Some of them became massive afterwards. And that, of course, is always the story of the counterculture, isn't it? Is that, however sort of insider it starts off, however small the core is, however pure it is, to use the word you used earlier, commercial interests come in. Whenever there's money to be made, people come in who've got not any interest in counterculture. They're just, there's a business opportunity. Dark stuff starts to happen. People get arrested. And of course, the music changes as well. I mean, it's interesting, in terms of the music that was going on at UFO. Some of those bands, Dan Tallion's Chariot, had been straight R&B bands, hadn't they?
Yeah.
They sort of, I don't know whether it was kind of cynical or not, but they'd seen where the tide was going and sort of hitch their, mixing my metaphors, they hitch their chariot in this case to hadn't they? And Zoot Money became Dan Tallion's Chariot.
Yeah, I mean, I love that transformation by Zoot Money, who, as you say, was like a very sort of traditional R&B, pretty cool,
super groovy.
Yeah. But change with the times. In a sense, that's exactly what the Beatles and Floyd and that's what they'd done really. The Floyd had started off as pretty much as a blues band, and their music is based in the blues. But I think the Dan Tallion's Chariot is probably the most exaggerated example of that transformation.
Yeah, and of course featuring Andy Summers on guitar, who went on for another transformation of his own and became hugely successful in the Police, right? Let's have another track. Love Makes Sweet Music by Soft Machine. That's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, Soft Machine, you know, quintessential UFO band, right? Yeah. Psychedelic and stuff. That's quite sort of solely R&B,
it really
isn't it?
Isn't it? I mean, I think Joe Boyd produced that, which I think might be sort of. I think he was going for something commercial, really, and it isn't really what Soft Machine ever were or ever would be. And it's not what they were playing at UFO. They were playing much more of their kind of trippy free jazz stuff. But Soft Machine are an interesting band, so that they pretty much came in and replaced Floyd as the house band.
Because Floyd were getting more successful.
Floyd were getting too big. And they were, you know, I think also Joe Boyd had lost control of Floyd at that point, so there was kind of political problems as well, because he'd produced the first single, and then he'd lost control.
Barrett had gone off the rails.
Barrett was going off the rails throughout this year. I mean, that's another sort of thing that was happening, I guess. So Soft Machine came in and they kind of took over. And Robert Wyatt's an interesting guy, because whenever you ask Robert Wyatt about you know, what was it like, the scene, he always says, well, I don't know, I was playing the gigs, you know, I was travelling, you know, I didn't really have the luxury of discovering what was going on at UFO, because either I was playing it or I was playing somewhere else. And I think that's quite interesting. You know, Townsend and McCartney were able to do it because of their size and stature, but for a lot of and Hendrix, but for a lot of the kind of jobbing musicians at this point, they were working. You know, so I don't think many of them had the time to come down to UFO because they were touring. Yeah,
they were sort of travelling up and down the M6 or the M1 in back of vans and stuff.
Yeah, they were probably in the service stations. They were in the Blue Boar.
Yeah, or then later going to the States, right?
Yeah.
Soft Machine, though, I mean, amazing. But that track, it is a bit more commercial. I mean, it's interesting hearing it now. I mean, say produced by Joe Boyd, it sounds quite unproduced, which is one of the great things about it.
Yeah. I think Robert Wyatt says that one of the things he loved about playing UFO was that they didn't really want to hear that R&B stuff there, but if they did, they wanted to hear it done quite roughly, and that's what they were quite good at, because that wasn't their strength. They weren't really that kind of a band.
We mentioned Barrett, and of course, it's difficult to have any kind of conversation about London at this time and without mentioning Syd Barrett, because of the kind of mythic status that he sort of achieved later, and also his arc. And he sort of represents in some way as well, doesn't he, the kind of dark underside of, you know, swinging 60s and the sort of the Summer of Love and UFO and stuff.
Yeah,
the drugs going bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the sort of quintessential acid casualty. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure he was a regular at UFO even when he wasn't playing there, and he couldn't take it. And there was no one there to kind of help him. Or people did. No, that's not fair. People tried to help him, but they couldn't.
There was this scene, as all scenes have got their kind of dark side, haven't they? And it's maybe it's there from the beginning, but from this time on, it starts to kind of like change a bit, doesn't it?
I think so. I mean, but I do think that, you know, acid was, you know, I think probably heroin was probably starting to creep in not long after this, and that almost, well, that obviously had a far sort of, more negative effect on the music scene than acid, which was, there were a handful of casualties, and Sid's obviously the one that everyone sort of knows about.
I mean, you can chart the changes in the music scene in this country, probably elsewhere, according to the drugs that came in, can't you? Because when you got the late 50s with speed and the mods and all that stuff, and
Pills
then
and uppers,
pills and uppers, and then weed comes in and it starts to mellow out a bit, and then acid comes in and it starts to get enlightened in some way or whatever, and then it's followed by heroin and cocaine, and then it starts to get much darker, doesn't it? And Jenny talks about that, that after the success of Groupie, her book, and what happened next, into the 70s, cocaine comes in, and
I mean, cocaine I don't think was around at all really in the late 60s. It was an early 70s thing, but heroin had always been there in the counterculture because of the kind of the jazz and the beat kind of origins really of the movement, and it came into music in 68, really. I think it was coming back into music. I mean, that's when Lennon was experimenting, as he would have described it. I don't think he did describe it, but that's what Lennon was taking heroin in 68.
And then cocaine, which, is that cocaine responsible for prog rock?
I often think of seriously? Cocaine as, I don't know if there's anything positive culturally that's come out from the use of cocaine. I'm not really sure. Maybe Motorhead. Although I think actually they were on speed, weren't they? They were on really bad speed.
You sort of you kind of associate cocaine with sort of the twilight creative years of artists, don't you?
Yeah.
Taking yourself a bit too seriously and getting a bit complicated about stuff.
Whereas acid, did produce some really great music.
It really did. So Pete, we're getting to the end of this. So of course, other clubs came after UFO, maybe not as influential, or was sat alongside it, Middle Earth and stuff, didn't they?
Yeah. So that was the other thing, I guess, is what we were talking about before, with the kind of the scene becomes less pure, the original scene anyway. Part of that is other people decide to see what's going on and decide they want to do it. So you had Middle Earth. You had fairly conventional venues, R&B venues. You had like the Flamingo Club, which had been a sort of important sort of early 60s R&B venue, renamed itself the Pink Flamingo, sort of painted itself pink and sort of tried to become a psychedelic venue. You had a similar thing happened at Ill Pie Island. It gave itself some like Colonel Barefoot's party place. Like, I gave itself some crazy name and tried to become a kind of hippie venue. These were successful to a lesser degree, I think, because they were quite blatant. Middle Earth did better because it was central, and it seemed a bit more genuine. There were real counterculture people involved in it. But yeah, I mean that was the general drift.
And maybe I have one more tune. This is The Move. Now, The Move, I don't know anything about The Move. I mean, the sort of fascinating, is it my imagination, or was Roy Wood in The Move?
Yeah, Roy Wood is in The Move. I love The Move. What I love about The Move is that they were really unsophisticated. They weren't unsophisticated, but they certainly weren't from this scene, but they knew how to make music that was for the scene.
And this track's called I Can Hear the Grass Grow. Again, it's not a sort of, you couldn't get away with that title these days, could you?
No, not at all. And I think this was the first song ever played on Radio 1 as well. And I think the last night, one thing I always find quite interesting is the last night of UFO was then followed by the first day of Radio 1. And that really is, for me, a kind of sign, that's a sign that it had worked. It had passed the baton on. Because Radio 1 was playing all those songs that had been played in UFO.
And that was a recognition. I mean, obviously Pirate Radio was pressing them from one side, wasn't it? It was a recognition that this counterculture was now becoming the culture.
Absolutely, and certainly in musical terms, yeah.
Pete, thank you. We're looking forward to next time.
Thank you very much.
In the meantime, this is The Move.
Attracted to a magnetic wave of sound. where the streets of colored circles are making their way around. I can hear the grass grow. I can hear the grass grow. I see rainbows in the evening. Can't seem to puzzle out the sign.
I Can Hear the Grass Grow by The Move, live at UFO Club, sometime in the late 1960s, finishing this episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture. Our guest was Peter Watts, journalist and countercultural commentator. You can check out more of Pete's work at his amazing blog, greatwen.com. That's W-E-N. I'm Stephen Coates. You can check out more of what we do at bureauoflostculture.com. See you next time for more strange, lost countercultural stories.